Welcome to Football Never Sleeps, the aspiring to be viral, always caffeinated, 40-yard dash avoiding weekly YouTube show all about Notre Dame football and your tutorial on how to recognize when the sky is falling and when it isn't. I'm Eric Hansen, toggling between spring football on-ramp and ongoing women's basketball March Madness. He's Tyler James, back from the NFL Scouting Combine in Indianapolis, and doing the three-cone drill to reimmerse himself in football recruiting. Together, we're the content creators and the dudes at InsideNDSports.com. On tonight's show, we'll share our first impressions of new Irish defensive coordinator Chris Ash and running backs coach Ja'Juan Seider, and also check in on the latest front office shuffling going on in new GM Mike Martin's world. NFL Combine and recruiting, we've got that too, and as always, your questions and our answers to them. So buckle up and plunge into the question portal. This is
Not a bad intro there, Eric. Not bad for splitting time women's basketball writer and Notre Dame football columnist, beat writer, YouTube host. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for everyone who has tuned in to us live tonight. We appreciate you all hanging out in the chat and creating conversation for us every week. For the uninitiated, make sure that you are subscribed to us here on our YouTube channel, which is free. That allows you to submit questions to us during the show and puts our content into your YouTube feed wherever, whenever we post a video. And we'd also like for you to join us over at InsideNDSports.com if you haven't already. That's where you can get access to our premium analysis and recruiting coverage and special access to us over on the Insider Lounge, where we share our inside information first. You can try us out over there with a 30-day free trial using promo code NDYT. It's scrolling at the bottom of the screen, and there's a link to subscribe in the video description below. Shout out Jason, shout out Rajon, Eric, and Bob for getting in comments or questions already. So we appreciate you guys hanging out with us tonight, and Eric will get us rolling.
okay. I have a little piece of trivia that I learned by looking at an old email. You know, the guitar licks in that intro?
Yes.
That is by a former member of the Chicago band. He was their guitarist way back in the 1980s. So,
all right.
So we got that going for us. Okay. We're going to get into football now. Our opening drive is our first glimpse at the Notre Dame defense under Chris Ash. Notre Dame defensive coordinator Chris Ash and running backs coach Ja'Juan Seider met with the Irish beat media for the first time last Wednesday at Notre Dame Stadium. So Ash's main message in that, he talked about 15 minutes and Ja'Juan talked about 15 minutes. His main message was, this is not my defense. It's the Notre Dame defense. And what we're gathering is a lot of this is going to be Al Golden 2.0. He goes from the school, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But he used the grammatically correct, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. So Tyler, what might be different though? Even though he's going to be working from the same scheme. What might be different in terms of what we see this spring?
Yeah. Well, first I would say there probably will be schematic changes in some ways or form that there's no use in sharing that with us the moment he meets us for the first time. But I think the biggest differences initially will be things like terminology, fundamentals, and technique, and how those are done. I think if Chris Ash follows what he says he does, like if he finds out, you know what, our defensive strength is this opposed to this last year, the scheme and what he calls will align with that. He wants to play whatever the strength of the players is. He cited players over plays and concepts over calls as one of his philosophies, and that being something that can lead to a more positionless defense. And you saw that a bit under Al Golden, where you're talking about guys like Jalen Sneed playing specific roles on third down that aren't your typical linebacker roles and stuff like that. So I think a lot of it sounds similar, and that was clearly a talking point that he came into the press conference with. He wanted to make that certain. And that makes sense. I don't think you want to come into a job where you're replacing the Broyles Award assistant coach of the year and say, you know what, I'm going to do it completely different than that guy. He didn't know what he was doing, because obviously that wasn't the case with what Al Golden was doing here previously at Notre Dame.
Yeah, for me, I agree with what you said in terms of some of the differences, and some I would add to it is how and when to pressure, and also if he leans more into stopping the run than Al Golden did. Al Golden played with what they call a lighter box a lot of times. A lot of teams will load the box and force teams to pass. Notre Dame did that less, and that's one of the reasons they were number one in pass efficiency defense the last couple of years, is that they didn't commit a safety to the run as much as some other teams might. So it'll be interesting to see his philosophy on that. And also, how and when to apply pressure. I'll give you an example of this. Brian Van Gorder, when he came from the NFL to Notre Dame ahead of the 2014 season, he was running Rex Ryan's defense. Well, Rex Ryan's defense was pretty good, but Brian Van Gorder didn't know when to push the buttons, which buttons to push. And I'm not saying Chris Ash won't know which buttons to push, but he may have a different philosophy on how he goes about doing that. So I think those are some of the differences. Tyler, you asked him a question during the press conference I thought had a pretty interesting response, and that had to do with recruiting. So do you want to take us through the question and the answer of that?
Yeah, well, I will add that I tend to ask new coaches about recruiting, and the most infamous response was from Brian Van Gorder when I asked him what did he like about recruiting, and he just gave me an and a long pause before he started to try to figure out something to say. But I asked Chris Ash specifically about like how different it is. I mean, he hasn't been in college football since 2020. A lot has changed since then, so he has a lot to learn. He knows that. And so he's asking lots of questions of those in the program, both as coaches and the recruiting staff that Notre Dame has, though that has shrunk in recent weeks. The guys that are still here and gals of how this works, what do we need to do? Who are we talking to? Obviously, I don't know that he's necessarily going to change significantly what guys Notre Dame's going after if they're already having success with those guys, but maybe he can add some more guys to the list that Notre Dame can go after. And so I think he at least handled that question well, and isn't afraid to ask what we need to do and what he needs to learn. I think from my perspective, it's helpful, not as like a dig at Al Golden, but Al Golden wasn't the biggest shoes that Notre Dame had as a recruiter. Like Golden was more of an oversight and explainer of his defense kind of guy than someone who was leading the relationship with recruits. So I think that makes the transition easier for Chris Ash. That I don't know that there's going to be a ton of pressure on him to be constantly in contact with recruits. But I think that will be an important part of his job. But I think that there's a reasonable expectation there as it comes to what Notre Dame has asked its defensive coordinator to do lately. And obviously it helps when your defense plays as well as Al Golden's did. You can sort of be the mastermind and not have to be like the go-to recruiter. What do you think of how he handled that, Eric?
I thought it was very honest, and I could see why, being away from college football for 4 years, where it's a seismic change in how everything around the relationships and recruiting has changed. So I thought he did a good job of being honest about it, and yet having a sense of, here's what's important. But yeah, I'm all ears in terms of how the NIL and how the direct payments and how all this other stuff, transfer portal, plays into it. I thought that was a good answer instead of trying to be a know-it-all and have all the answers. I liked his honesty there. So other top takeaways during his 14 and a half minutes.
Yeah, I mean, he described his defense of wanting to play fast, violent, physical, win at the point of attack. I think any defensive coordinator should include those things in their.
We're going to be passive. We're going to read and react and let the offense dictate to us.
We're gonna think a lot about what we're doing. And one thing, and I asked him about this as well, was that he made it seem like he'll be somewhat positionless as a coordinator, like Al Golden eventually became. And he said specifically, Mike Mickens doesn't need my help in terms of being a defensive backs coach, and that is pertinent because Chris Ash has coached safeties in the past. So I was curious if he'll be responsible for a position, and he didn't make it seem that way. Now maybe that ends up changing, but at least the way it was described, he'll be bouncing around from position to position to get a sense of everything, and that makes sense, especially as a new guy trying to learn the personnel of your defense.
Yeah, I agree, and I thought one interesting takeaway too was why now? Marcus had reached out to Chris Ash. He wasn't looking for a job at the time, but this was very special. He thought this was a special opportunity. Again, it speaks to how coaches are viewing Marcus as he goes into his fourth year as a head coach, that this isn't looked as a risk or a gamble with Marcus. So I thought that was kind of interesting from that standpoint, and that, he's not desperate for necessarily an avenue to become a college head coach again. Now that may happen, but this didn't feel like that was his main motivation for coming to Notre Dame. The one thing is, and I've read some comments from people, they're like, well, he'll only be here for 2 or 3 years. That's kind of the shelf life for just about any offensive coordinator, offensive or defensive at Notre Dame. You don't have, even during the Lou Holtz times and times before that, you didn't have these big, long runs of being a coordinator. Coaches will move on to either the NFL, or they'll become head coaches, or they'll get rid of them if they're not very good. So they'll be in demand. So I would think he wouldn't be here any longer than 2 or 3 years. And if he does well, or if he doesn't do well.
Yeah, I don't know that I took I wasn't looking for a job thing as positively. Now I don't know how truthful it is either. Like, he was an NFL scout. Was that really what he thought was his best and most admirable position right in this point of his
this is a guy that
career?
Used to be in charge of kids detasseling corn, so so I don't know that he's looking for glamour.
Well, yeah, but I mean,
I'm just kidding.
It's not about glamour, but I think drive and passion, I think would be something that it's like, well, is that, I don't know. I think it sounds better to say it than maybe it actually is. I don't know. Of course, if you're offered the Notre Dame defensive coordinator job and you're an NFL scout, why wouldn't you take? Is there anyone that wouldn't take that job? I don't know. Does that exist? Does that person exist? I'm not sure that it does.
Well, I think if your career path at that point, if you said, I want to get into personnel, I want to be an NFL GM someday, I think probably you would stay in that role. But
right, but you probably weren't going to be offered the job either. You probably wouldn't have an extensive coaching background like he has.
Right.
It was just a weird position that he was in based on his track record. So unless he was very passionate about scouting, I don't think many people would have considered him as someone that was going to be a scout for the rest of his life. So I think I'm not saying this that has any sort of that will play any sort of outcome in terms of what Chris Ash is like as a defensive coordinator at Notre Dame. But I'm not sure that that was an award-winning comment, at least from my perspective.
Oh, wow. We're giving out awards for comments. Do you want to go to questions before we go to Ja'Juan?
Isn't that what we're supposed to do? We're supposed to say if it's a home run or a double or a single, or if we get awards after press conferences.
He won the press conference. Do we want to do award-winning questions before we do Ja'Juan Seider?
Yeah, we can do that. I thought there was an Ash specific one in here. Yeah. Rajon says, if Ash changes too much, might the players not like it? Also, he'll have to run things by Marcus Freeman. No?
Well, I think they've already talked about that before he was hired, what his approach would be. But I mean, I think Marcus would have been okay with him making a lot of changes. Marcus was okay with Al Golden making a lot of changes. And initially, when Marcus Freeman was looking for his first defensive coordinator, his thought was trying to align it closer to his own philosophy and running his defense. And then when it became Al Golden, he said, okay, he needs to run his own defense. And there were differences. There were more differences than I think Marcus anticipated. But I think all in all, this won't be as much continuity as, let's say, going from Mike Elko to Clark Lee, but I think it may be more continuity than, say, going from Clark Lee to Marcus Freeman.
Yeah, and the fact that Ash is such a veteran coach, like he should, like, yes, Al Golden ran a very detailed defense, but it shouldn't be stuff that Chris Ash can't grasp or doesn't have experience understanding the kinds of defenses that Al Golden was implementing. So I think that the transition there is there's nothing that can guarantee that it will be smooth, but it should be able to be smooth. I guess
they have somewhat similar backgrounds. They although Al Golden came up as a 34 guy, he was a 43 guy at Notre Dame. Yeah, they both have some NFL experience. They both have been head coaches.
Although Golden was a little bit more successful.
He was a little bit more successful. And Chris Ash probably was a little bit more successful as a defensive coordinator, although he wasn't as long as Al Golden. But, I mean, he won a national championship with Ohio State.
Sure.
So.
All right, Beefeater ND08, and I can handle this unless you want to chime in, Eric. He says, how long until the Western Michigan coaching staff wins a natty? And I will say forever. My parents are Western Michigan grads, so I think I'm allowed to say that. But Western Michigan is never winning a national championship in football.
Okay, what was it? Is there an inside joke that I'm not getting, or is that?
I don't know. I mean, Lance Taylor's there, Chris O'Leary's there. Beefeater likes to be comical in his questions. I know that.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, okay. So while we caffeinate, Beefeater can have his beer.
Let's see what else here. Bob Oxnard says over or under 100 during broadcast and press conferences between now and the end of the upcoming football season. Will the NIU loss be mentioned more or fewer than 100 times?
During broadcasts and press conferences. So that's what we're limiting that to. I'm going to go way over.
I don't know.
It got really old at the end of this year. So
yeah, but I just don't know that it will happen again next year unless there's another similar game, right? Like what? I mean, it doesn't really.
Well, but I think that there are you underestimate the laziness of some of the people in our business too.
Yeah.
To not find new story angles.
Yeah,
they're still mad about Northern Illinois.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll take the under. I'll go the other way. I just don't. I mean,
okay. Well, Bob, we'll put you in charge of counting and telling
yeah,
me
Bob.
later.
Yeah. I have to do all the counting for place your bet, so we're gonna put this one on Bob to track all the Northern Illinois references, and I'll make sure that Eric isn't stuffing the ballot box by asking a bunch of NIU questions over the next
when
year.
We're at 99, I'll ask the 100th.
And then Eric Swope asked about the NFL Combine, and so we'll get to that a little bit later, so we can get into some Ja'Juan Seider topics. If you guys have more questions, feel free to keep them coming. We will get through them throughout the show.
So Ja'Juan Seider comes to Notre Dame from 7 years at Penn State. He was a college quarterback at West Virginia and Florida A&M. He actually played in Notre Dame Stadium in 1997, or he was on the sideline anyways. Mark Bulger was the starting quarterback for West Virginia. Then I was covering Notre Dame back then, so I was at that game. But I thought his main message was how he goes about making this talented running back room better by identifying players' weaknesses, getting them to own them, and working on those. Now, that's not the only way he goes about doing that, but I thought it was really interesting. He talked about that particular day texting them and having them come up with their weaknesses. Tyler, when you had a chance to listen to Ja'Juan, how do you think he'll impact the offense? Similarly to Deland McCullough, and maybe differently?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels with Seider and McCullough. They seem both very confident in their track records as running backs coaches. Seider is big on rotation, just like McCullough was. I thought it was interesting that Seider talked about if you want to learn route running, hang out with the wide receivers. If you want to learn how to block, hang out with the offensive linemen. One thing he said was, if I'm teaching them how to run, we recruited the wrong guys. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think very similarly. The biggest difference I think potentially would be Seider's understanding of offenses as a former quarterback, and what he would like to, or sort of what perspective he brings to the coaching staff as it relates to that. We'd only be speculating on how that ends up playing out in terms of play calling or offensive schemes. But I think Mike Denbrock likes to have the opinions and track records and voices from different guys to have a better understanding of what can make this offense better. And I think from my perspective, I don't see any negatives to what Seider could be as Notre Dame's running backs coach.
Yeah, one of the things I thought was interesting when he was talking about being a former quarterback is he wants to teach his running backs to see the game through the quarterback's eyes. He wants them to be able to identify coverages, identify fronts. And he said, now, I don't know if they were being taught that or not, but that's going to be something I emphasize. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yep.
He was a guy that was way more interesting than I thought he was going to be. I was like, keep him on here for another 15 minutes. And then, of course, the recruiting question came up with him, and he's been in the college game for the last 4 years during all these changes, but I thought his answer was interesting. So what did you make of, why don't you share Seider's philosophy on recruiting and what you made of his answer?
Yeah, you can sort of tell by the length of the answer of how actually interested in and thoughtful he is as it relates to recruiting. He's big on relationships. He wants to know who helps make decisions when it comes to recruits, and form relationships with those folks as well. He emphasized that he refuses to get outworked, and he believes that trust still matters in the current culture that is impacted by NIL. But it still comes down to playing football, and you have to have trust in the coach that you're playing for. So I think he brings a very personal touch to recruiting, intentionally. And then obviously he has the track record of success that he can point to as well in terms of running backs he's coached, and been able to get them produced both at the college level and the NFL level. So I think there's a lot to like there. It was not surprising to me. I generally thought that he would be more interesting when it came to the press conference. So if we had to, the way it worked out, I ended up driving down to the combine that night. So Eric wrote both stories on both the guys. But if we had to coin toss for who was going, I was going to weigh my side heavier on Seider if I had the choice. I just was more interested in him. And I think the fact that he has had such recent success at Penn State is intriguing, and the fact that he chose to come to Notre Dame despite having such a talented backfield at Penn State is very intriguing as well.
Yeah, he's a guy that I could see why he does well in recruiting. Now, again, I'm not a 17-year-old, and I almost have a 17-year-old grandson now. He's 16, but I could see why parents would like him. I could see why kids would like him. I thought one thing that was really interesting was the way that he wouldn't involve himself in the offense. He wouldn't sit up in a meeting and say, well, we did it this way. So he's going to be welcome. He's going to welcome his involvement if Mike Denbrock asks him a question, but he's not going to try to be the smartest guy in the room. He also talked about his background with Marcus Freeman. These guys have known each other for quite some time. when Marcus Freeman and Jared Parker were at Purdue, they became acquainted, and to the point where they'd run into each other in coaching clinics, recruiting trail. And he said, it's almost like talking to myself. He feels like he's so similar to Marcus Freeman. So any other takeaways from Ja'Juan from you, Tyler?
Yeah, I think that tracks. Like he came off as someone who seemed very genuine in his press conference, and I think that's one of the first words that people associate with Marcus Freeman when they talk to Marcus Freeman. So a couple other things was, I guess just the one other thing that I wanted to highlight is just like how, like what he said about Notre Dame. Why he came to or like how it felt to be Notre Dame. He said when he got to campus, like the whole operation was first class. I think he even mentioned Marcus Freeman picking him up. He said he felt the why of Notre Dame, and that's why it's special, and that's why there's only one Notre Dame. And I thought that was a good. I mean, a lot of guys. I think a lot of Notre Dame fans feel that way about Notre Dame. And coaches can kind of say it, but for whatever reason, it just sort of rang like it felt like this is something that Ja'Juan Seider really felt like he explained it in a good way that it seemed genuine. Like so obviously that's a common theme there, but and I think that only helps. You recruit to Notre Dame, you could associate and relate to your players. I think that's a very valuable asset as a coach at Notre Dame.
So I'm going to read the quote real quick. He compared it to when he came in as a player. He said, I really need to get a chance to feel Notre Dame when you come in as a different team, because you just come in for business. You come to play the game, when lose, go home, right? He said, now, when you come on the campus, you feel Notre Dame, whatever it is. I don't know what it is, how to explain it, but it's just different. You walk different. You talk different. You stand up different. You sit different. And I just think it's from the top, meeting with Father Dowd, meeting with Adam Sargent in academics, meeting with Freeman, him picking me up at the airport. It was just first class, and you understand the why. You feel the why at Notre Dame like it is special, and that's why it's only one Notre Dame. I mean, it sounds like it should be on a T-shirt or a collectible plate.
Yeah. It's like or you watch a lot of Lou Holtz talking about Notre Dame tape too. Like it feels like if you put those words in Lou Holtz's mouth, I think you would be like, yeah, that's definitely something Lou Holtz would say about Notre Dame too.
And John O'Connor, thank you for the compliment. Okay, go ahead.
All right, we got to make sure you get your compliment thank yous in. Beefeater did follow up. He also reminded us that Greer Martini is at Western Michigan, and then that reminded me that Nick Coleman, former Notre Dame defensive back, is also the new corners coach at Western. So Greer Martini is the linebackers coach there under Chris O'Leary. He also said, if that staff was at Notre Dame, would they win a championship? I would have my doubts there. But
there's some good coaches.
Yeah,
you're not going to have the resources at Western Michigan, and they're not going to win that. Not with Lance Taylor as the head coach at this point of his career. But that's a nice staff. Right, they're putting it together.
It's interesting that those guys are getting experience at that level, and those could be names of importance for Notre Dame in the future. Maybe if Lance Taylor has all kinds of success, whenever Marcus Freeman retires, there's someone that could be interested in coaching at Notre Dame, or Chris O'Leary, and then obviously guys that went to Notre Dame like Greer Martini and Nick Coleman. Those would make sense that those guys are getting good coaching experience at a lower level, and it's always good to have Notre Dame connections in the coaching field. If you're in the market and those guys establish themselves as one of the top coaches at their positions.
And if I remember right, Lance Taylor is good at naming his kids. He named his son Jet as opposed to, I guess, Snail. So,
I don't know if they're going to win the MAC. I don't know enough about the MAC conference and who's all coming back. And I would need to do more studying on the MAC personnel before I gave you an answer.
I never bet against Chuck Martin.
Yeah, so we'll try to stick in our lane as it relates to the Notre Dame analysis. All right, that's all the questions, Eric.
Okay, we're going to move on to Notre Dame's front office moves, and we're calling it the front office just to make it easier rather than the support staff. Caleb Davis, the director of recruiting, 25 years old, is the latest key personnel piece to leave the Irish this offseason. He's the new GM at San Diego State. That happened right before one of my women's basketball games last week. I think it was the Florida State game. Prior to Davis leaving, Carter Allman had been promoted to a director of recruiting role. So it was similar to what Davis was doing. He's not replacing Davis, but they were, for a short time, doing similar roles, kind of like Chad Bowden. And who was the other guy that was doing it with him at the beginning?
Was it Dre Brown or was that someone else?
Dre Brown, yes.
Okay.
Mike Martin actually is officially named and on the job. So let's take a look at this Caleb Davis move. What should the timeline look like to replace Caleb Davis in his role?
Yeah, I think in my head said, well, probably by the beginning of the spring practice is probably what would make sense. Although with Notre Dame,
about 2 weeks away.
Yeah, for Notre Dame, I don't know. Like Pot of Gold Day is a big thing for Notre Dame, St. Patrick's Day, so that would be before the start of Notre Dame's spring football, but just by a couple of days. You'd hopefully have someone in place by then, but whoever that is going to have a lot of catching up to do. So I think either way, the folks that are already on campus with Carter Allman, Becca Seitz, who's the director of on-campus recruiting, Dela McCullough II, who's in charge of high school relations, they'll have been doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and I think the coaching staff can help out during what is a dead period now. But when practices get going,
laughing at you, I'm laughing at the beefaroni comment.
When practices get going, there's a lot more organization and relationship building that has to happen when the coaches are coaching. So I think making sure that as best as Notre Dame can, barring like it preventing them from getting the best hires, you would want to have things sort of ironed out in terms of your recruiting staff by the time spring practice gets rolling.
So you guys know who the adult in the room is. It's the younger guy of the two of us. So what should Mike Martin's to-do list look like other than talking to us? What do you think should be his priorities right now?
Yeah, I think finalizing Notre Dame's staff in terms of the recruiting staff and whatever role that they're looking to fill in terms of helping his position, analyzing Notre Dame's roster in terms of the talent that he believes Notre Dame has, be prepared for what's coming in April as it relates to the revenue sharing, and then sort of starting to anticipate what the portal market will be in terms of who will be leaving from Notre Dame, who maybe they need to ask to leave Notre Dame, and then also who Notre Dame could start pursuing once they enter the portal in that April window, because I think there's still an opportunity if Notre Dame sees fit and there are talented enough guys in the portal that it would make sense for maybe Notre Dame to add one or two more guys, and maybe more if there's a lot of talent that Notre Dame likes.
So in terms of Mike Martin adding staff, don't you think it behooves him to maybe not go by what the jobs were before and the job titles and the job descriptions? That they need to be a little bit more open to that just because of everything that could be changed. And his skill set's different than Chad Bowden's.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think there's an overall sort of probably restructuring that needs to happen in terms of what Notre Dame's support staff and scouting staff and recruiting staffs look like. And that could be part of the whole semantics of what Carter Allman's title has been since the end of last season and what Caleb Davis's was. I mean, I think it was mostly, in essence, was an all hands on deck situation once Chad Bowden left, that everyone needed to be contributing and making sure that that recruiting was still continuing and allowing for Notre Dame to be in a position to get kids on campus in the spring, scheduling official visits, which there have been a ton of official visits set for June to Notre Dame. I think it all sorts of everything needs to have And I sometimes, from my experience covering Notre Dame, it seems like it's hard for new titles to be created as it relates to I don't know what sort of allocations need to be made for the staff in terms of who has to approve a new job title versus a one that you're replacing someone. Because I mean, even when Chad Bowden became the GM, he wasn't in like it was still director of player personnel or something. Like there was some other old title that Notre Dame had been using, which had been morphed into essentially a GM, but it wasn't quite the GM yet, because I think there's sometimes slow moving in terms of creating new job titles and what that means for the athletic department and stuff. So we may see at first like these guys fall into similar titles that they've had in the past, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the roles are the same as what they were in the past, if that makes sense. And I don't know if anything of what I just said made sense, because I think I may have confused myself.
I'll caffeinate after that answer.
All right.
So do we want to move on to questions or combine?
Let's do combine. Rajon has a recruiting question, and I know we'll get into that after the combine. And so, yeah, Eric Swope says, interested in your thoughts regarding our Fighting Irish in the combine this past weekend, along with the results. Thank you.
Okay, so Notre Dame's elongated season affected the participation level of Notre Dame invitees at the actual combine. A lot of these guys deferred their workouts to Notre Dame's Pro Day, which we don't have a date yet. I'm guessing late March for that. But of those who did participate, what were your impressions, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, only Mitchell Evans is the truly tested. He did some running and jumping. His 40 of 4.74 isn't necessarily great, but I think it's good in context. He was tied for 7th among the tight ends who ran. I believe there's 14 who ran, and the 6 who ran faster than him all weighed more than him, and all but one of them weighed at least 10 pounds less than him. All but one of them was by 10 pounds. So like he's a bigger guy than the other guys that he's being measured up against. So I think that was a decent time for him, especially considering that he didn't have a lot of time to train for it. Some of these guys since mid-December have been training on how to run the fastest 40. And that's obviously not what Mitchell Evans was up to. He was playing football till late January.
Right.
So that's different. And then Riley Leonard and Jack Kaiser were the only other two who did anything physically. Leonard threw and Jack Kaiser did linebacker drills. Neither of them tested. I thought Kaiser was sharp as expected. I thought Leonard looked pretty good. I don't know that one throwing session like that is going to significantly change the outlook on Riley Leonard and what he's been as a player, because he has played so much football. So nothing bad. I don't think there was nothing discouraging about how those guys did. Mitchell Evans didn't have great numbers in terms of broad jump or vertical jump, so maybe there's some questions there about his explosiveness. But also, I mean, he's also a guy, like we said, he just came off of the football season, so maybe he's not at his most explosive right now either.
Did anyone hurt themselves by not participating as long as they do so at the Pro Day if they're healthy?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Unless one of those guys could have ripped a great 40 and just chose not to. But I think if they could have, they would have. Like Bo Collins, for instance, I think he's someone that probably will eventually test well. So I think that it makes a lot of sense. I think the one thing that came to mind when you asked this was that Sean Crawford back in 2023, he tweeted something about Notre Dame's indoor turf being soft and slow, which isn't something I had given consideration for. He said that it was a great facility and field for practice, but not.
Wasn't talking about the media?
I'm sorry?
Are you sure he wasn't talking about the media, soft and slow?
Yes, I'm sure. Although that would be true as well. But he had said that they tried to move it into the Loftus to run 40s when he went through the Pro Day process. So maybe something to consider. These guys aren't going to have combine times. That maybe they're their top time will be on what some consider a slow track. Now, I don't even know for certain if it's the same turf or if there's been improvements to that since Sean Crawford was in school, but I thought that was at least noteworthy.
During the 9 years he was in school?
Just yeah, kidding. Exactly.
Okay, and then what are your thoughts on Ben Morrison's draft stock? We always kind of refer to him as a future first-round draft choice, and then we've seen some projection with him being in the second round. What do you think is going to happen with him?
Yeah,
and what were your takeaways from your talk with him too?
I mean, I think obviously the concern is his hip in terms of what will he look like bouncing back from that. I think there was something that indicated that maybe he had 2 surgeries on his hip, and I'm not even sure if that's true or not, or if that was a mistake. I think it might have been Dane Brugler of The Athletic in one of his big boards made it seem like there were 2 hip surgeries. That's not at least how Benjamin Morrison described it, but he wasn't exactly pressed on his surgeries at the combine, at least by the reporters. I imagine the teams would have all the information necessary in terms of that. We waited for almost an hour for him to get to the press conference area from when he was scheduled, because he was
not as long as we waited for Niel.
Yeah. So that he was doing medicals then. So I asked him a question what's it like going through this process when the medical stuff's out of his control? Like there's nothing he can do about what happened to him or where he's at in his recovery and those things. So he was pretty honest about that. Like you sort of have some thoughts about, man, what am I doing? Like how did we get to this point where everyone's questioning my physical ability when I was this great player for so long during his Notre Dame career? I think as long as his hip is fine and there's no long-term concern with it, he's going to be a steal if he's picked in the second round, in my opinion. He won't be quite ready, he said, to test at Notre Dame's Pro Day, but he'll be here supporting his teammates. And they'll have a private workout that doesn't have a date for, but it has to sort of be in April based on when Notre Dame's Pro Day will be, and then when the NFL draft is. So we'll see what comes
NFL
of that. When
draft is the last weekend in April,
right? And I would imagine Notre Dame's Pro Day will be near the very end of March as well. So, those are my thoughts on Benjamin Morrison. Do you have concerns about him as an NFL player?
Not if he's 100% healthy. I think he's outstanding. Just his technique, and just his rise. I mean, he is so smart, such a class person. I love where his career is headed again, as long as he's healthy. And he's got NFL bloodlines too. So I think he's got a really exciting future. I'd buy stock in him.
All right.
So any other takeaways from the combine that you want to highlight? I know there's some stories you have coming this week about what some of the players think about the next quarterback at Notre Dame and other positions and so forth, but anything you want to hear?
Yeah, I like to ask those guys about who they think is sort of next at their position, or it could even be beyond their position. Most of the times, obviously that's who they know the most about. Maybe if you're talking about a receiver, he could give you who's next at cornerback from going against him. But obviously Notre Dame has young cornerbacks, so next are the guys that were playing all last season at cornerback. There's a story that published earlier today on some of the wide receivers that Bo Collins and Mitchell Evans highlighted. And then I'll have some of the guys' thoughts on the quarterback competition, and that'll run tomorrow over on InsideNDSports.com. So check that out if you're interested. I thought they all handled the combine is an interesting thing. You get asked all kinds of questions, not just from the teams, but from the reporters who are gathered there. There's all kinds of interesting characters that have their own self-interest in mind when it comes to.
Did you talk to the Eagles? You talked to the Eagles?
Yeah. What teams did you talk to? And one guy asked Riley Leonard a couple questions, and he was wearing a USC hoodie. I thought that was interesting, and so did Riley. He said nice sweatshirt, clearly tongue in cheek, but he obviously answered just quite. He wasn't gonna not answer the guy's question because he was wearing a USC hoodie, but I thought
was it Chad Bowden?
It was not. No, it was not Chad. Chad wasn't. We would have known it was Chad because he would have been carrying a boombox with the Six Flags song following around.
Okay, we can move on to the next topic, or we can go to questions.
Yeah, let's go to questions, and then we'll get into some recruiting. Jason Smith said, "Any chance that Kevin Bauman is the second tight end behind Eli Raridan and has a really good year with some impact plays?"
He's certainly going to get the opportunity in the springtime to show whether that's a reality or not, because there's not many healthy tight ends, and he's one of them on scholarship. There's James Flanagan, the really good freshman, doesn't come until June. Ty Washington, the transfer from Arkansas, doesn't come until June, and Cooper Flanagan is injured. So it's going to be Jack Larson, Kevin Bauman, and Eli Raridan in the spring. So by the end of the spring, we should have our answer to that question.
Yeah, it's hard to say because we've just seen so little of him healthy, and I mean, it would be a great story certainly. I think everyone that I've asked him about him speaks very highly of him as a person, and the value that he's played in terms of being a team guy and sticking it out. And I don't know, the fact that he's even willing to go through another spring practice, given everything he's gone through in college football, I think speaks a lot to him. And because that's the thing. I mean, he could feel like, okay, I'm just gonna go out there in the spring and then I'm gonna not play again like I did last year. When it comes to because obviously there's gonna be more.
I think he only played 7 reps after October. I mean, it wasn't very much.
Right. So maybe to be willing to put himself through that says a lot about him. And it'll be interesting to see what he can do. He's certainly got the size and strength. I'm not sure
and the uninjured version of him was pretty good.
Yeah, he was considered very highly coming out of high school, and there were a lot of good things said about him early in his career coming or at Notre Dame. Ray John says, Eric, do you think the USC game is in jeopardy?
I don't think as of now. And when I talk to Pete Bavacqua about it, he keeps assuring whenever he's asked about it that both sides want this to happen. So whether Lincoln Riley blathers about it or not, I don't think is the issue. If you start hearing the USC AD start saying something that's in alignment with Lincoln Riley, then maybe there's an issue there. I think what may change about that is it won't have the same rhythm in the schedule where you have USC coming to Notre Dame in the middle of October one year and then Notre Dame finishing out the season at USC at the end of November the next year. That may end up changing, and maybe it won't be an annual thing, but I know both sides would like that for now, would like that series to continue.
Yeah, I mean, to me, if it's not an annual thing, then it's not what it was. It loses its luster if it's not an annual thing. And to me, it would seemingly be easier if they just made it the same week every year. So I guess it depends on the importance of having that game, right? Is Notre Dame willing to stay home?
You mean have it the same week every year, home or away, or the same rhythm that it is now?
Have it the same year, have it the same week, year after year.
So like mid-October. Because it's not going to be late November. They're not going to come here at late November and play in the snow, right?
Well, I mean, is it any easier to make sure? I mean, to fill out your Big Ten schedule with a mid-October Notre Dame game? I don't know. I don't know what's easier. What's easier or harder? You know what I mean? That's the problem. So I think consistency would make it easier because then okay, well we can't schedule USC for this week every year, because they're playing Notre Dame this week every year, regardless of who it is. Now that's from the Big Ten scheduling perspective. So I don't know what sort of weight that will play in it. And then obviously there's the discussion about the SEC and Big Ten scheduling a series against each other, where I believe every team in each of those conferences will be playing another team from the other conference on an annual basis. But it's not annual either. I don't know. So I think the way for it to continue the way it has been is becoming, the path for that is narrower and narrower, it seems. So everyone says the right things publicly, but I don't know. I mean, certainly there's added intrigue if it keeps happening the way with the Chad Bowden and Marcus Freeman connections with the rivalry now, because Chad Bowden, as you would expect, is being very positive and brash about what he's joining at USC, and they're really hitting the ground running in terms of recruiting in the 2026 class. So we'll see what comes of it. I just, because like so much changes in college football, I don't like, history doesn't seem to matter to a lot of people, so I just don't take for granted that those kinds of things.
Well, you're right on that. It doesn't matter to a lot of people. There's been a lot of history that's gotten thrown away because of realignment.
Right.
Let me ask you something while you're talking about Chad Bowden, because I saw a tweet today regarding him, and I got a question in my chat that I didn't take last week that kind of quoted you and some other people. So I want to get your opinion on it. So Chad Bowden is the GM at USC. So is this something to, hide in the basement about, that USC is going to get all the California recruits now and the sky's falling or whatever? I mean, I would think that he's going to help their recruiting, but if they stink on the field, it's not going to entice. I mean, Notre Dame's not going to ever not be able to recruit kids out of California. What's your take?
Yeah, I think it's going to be harder. To recruit. Like, if USC is truly doing this now, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it. But I don't think you can't really get away with saying it for long if you're not doing it, So it makes sense I don't know why USC wouldn't have been doing this in the first place.
Exactly.
So like, I think that calls into question Lincoln Riley as a head coach and program runner. Like, why weren't you making this a priority? So I mean, that's an angle that maybe Notre Dame can play. It's like, well, now you're a priority, but they weren't when they were. they learned that they needed you now, so now they're coming back to you begging that we value California. So I mean, it's not the end of the world for Notre Dame and recruiting in California, I don't think. I just think it's going to be more difficult, and it has been more difficult at times for Notre Dame, and Notre Dame has other places it can recruit than just California. But it has won big recruiting battles in California against USC for guys like Kingston Viliamu-Asa and Madden Faremo. And it will have its hands full in trying to continue to do that. I don't think the presence of Chad Bowden is going to prevent Notre Dame from recruiting kids out of California.
Well, and what if Lincoln Riley suddenly is on the hot seat? What if they aren't better this year? What if they're a middling?
Right. Yeah. US or recruiting hype can go away pretty fast if the results on the field don't follow. Like, USC can't pitch it's a different place just because of its GM, right? Like, USC as a football program is going to be like viewed for what it is on the football field. And so the success has to follow that. So it could be a blip, or it could be a long-term path to success for USC too. So wait and see. But in recruiting, the promise of what it could be sometimes is just as important as what the promise of, or what it has been. And so I think it does matter what USC is doing now. I think they have the top recruiting class in the country, according to Rivals. I'll look that up while I'm talking here, but they've done a pretty good job. Yeah, they have 11 commitments, and are number one overall, just ahead of Oregon. But Oregon does have a higher star average at 4.1 compared to 3.82, which the star average actually is lower than Notre Dame. So Notre Dame has 7 commits, and its star average is 3.86. So that's slightly above where USC is at. But obviously USC wants to hit the ground and sort of stamp what it's doing and build on momentum in the 2026 class.
So I cleverly and mistakenly put us in a great position to either go into recruiting from here or go to more questions. So it's up to you.
Well, we'll do both. We'll use this Rajon question about recruiting. And Rajon says 26 recruiting has to pick up the pace, don't you think? Is it time to worry? it does have to continue to progress, but I think that's a bit overplayed. Like I said, Notre Dame's star average is 3.86. Notre Dame is 6th in the country according to Rivals in terms of team rankings, which is better than what it finished last year. Now, granted, Notre Dame has been accustomed to being like number one, like where USC is right now, and then it starts to tail off because some of the other bigger programs close stronger than Notre Dame does, and Notre Dame built up its numbers earlier on. Notre Dame certainly has a lot of work left to do. I think every program does at this point. It's early. We're not yet to the official visit stage. We're not even to spring football yet. And so there has
We're not
been
even a spring weather yet.
yeah. I think folks sort of assume, okay, we just played for the national championship. Aren't these commitments just going to start coming right and left? And I don't think that was ever going to happen necessarily. And then the departures hurt. Like, if maybe it would be different if Chad Bowden was still here, because there's still that momentum that is there. And I think Notre Dame did lose some momentum from that. Like, the guys that were still at Notre Dame did their best in terms of trying to keep that going, but there is some lost relationships there. There is some like wait and see, okay, who's going to be replaced. And then obviously Notre Dame loses some assistant coaches. You lose Al Golden, you lose Dylan McCullough. So I think, I don't think it's like panic time by any means. Like, Notre Dame has a lot of work to do, but I think it was always going to be that way. Notre Dame wasn't going to be at like 15 commitments at March 3rd of 2025 for the 2026 class. So there's plenty of time for Notre Dame to start doing better. I think there are a lot of high-profile recruits that are considering Notre Dame, and then we'll learn more about how they feel about Notre Dame once they get on campus, either for a spring visit or for a June official visit.
Okay. The 2026 Rivals rankings came out, or re-rankings came out today. Anything that you want to highlight from those other than people get angry?
Yeah, so all of Notre Dame's commits dropped, but nothing major. I think the most in the Rivals 250, excuse me, I have the hiccups all of a sudden, overall was I think it was Chasten Smith dropped 11 spots, and everyone dropped fewer in terms of overall rankings, and I think most of them stayed the same. I think Tyler Merrill was the only one that dropped. He dropped one spot in the position rankings. He was the number 3 inside offensive lineman, or interior offensive lineman is the word that, or the phrase that Rivals is now using. And now he's number 4, but he's still a top 100 recruit. But there were some major movers that moved up in terms of guys that Notre Dame's going after. And a lot of them are more recent targets for Notre Dame that Notre Dame has identified with offers in the last couple months. Felix Ojo is one of them, out of Texas. He also was just recently promoted to a 5-star recruit. So Notre Dame offered him either in
He also followed me on X today.
Oh, there you go. Either in late January or early February, he was offered by Notre Dame, and that came when Joe Rudolph went down and visited his school. And then we broke the news today that he plans to visit Notre Dame on April 11th. We put that on the Insider Lounge as soon as we heard about it this morning. He also plans to visit Ohio State and Florida in the spring, and then has some official visits scheduled. Not one to Notre Dame yet in terms of an official visit, but if things go well on his unofficial, I would imagine there would be a follow-up official visit to that. And some of the other guys that moved up a lot, Ian Premer out of Kansas. He's one of Notre Dame's new tight end targets. Claude Puma is out of Chicago Mount Carmel, a very athletic offensive tackle who transferred into Mount Carmel this after this past football season as a basketball player at Mount Carmel right now. I think he's 6'7" or 6'8", very athletic kid that Notre Dame likes a lot. Damari Simeon, defensive tackle. I know that's always a major concern for Notre Dame fans. He's visited Notre Dame twice out of New Jersey. He moved up in the Rivals 250. He's now the number 14 defensive tackle in the 2026 class. So that may be a name to monitor moving forward, and someone that Rivals sees as a rising prospect.
All right. Do we want to make one more run through for questions, or any more recruiting stuff, or did Joe Long say something funny again besides beefaroni?
Rajon said, can you name a player or two to keep an eye on as the next commit? Trying Trying to think in terms of timeline of who would make sense. I mean, a lot of times commitments tend to come after visits. So maybe someone that's coming in March. And I think some of that is still getting fleshed out. So, I mean, maybe Brody Keefe, a wide receiver, if there's a high interest there. He's a 2026 recruit. He's planning to get here at the end of March. A lot of the visits that are being scheduled, at least solidified, have been official visits, so that's not till June. So I don't know that Notre Dame's going to go until June without getting a couple commitments. So I don't know that I have a sense of who would be the closest to committing to Notre Dame right now. Jacoby Xavier kid out of Cincinnati, a linebacker. He's someone that I think ends up in Notre Dame's class eventually in terms of when he decides to commit. Obviously, it's anyone's guess, but those would be some guys to maybe keep an eye on. I think one of the good things about where Notre Dame is at, it seems like a lot of these big time guys that they're going after aren't in a rush to make a decision. And so Notre Dame's like not behind in terms of where other schools are with them, because it's not like the things are necessarily nearly done yet. So a lot of things to track as we move into spring football practice later this month.
Okay. Well, anything else in closing before I say my last words here, or do we have anything else we want to get to?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everybody showing up today. We'll be back next Monday night. Again, we're a couple of weeks away from spring practice. Thanks for all the questions and the comments, and even the little side gags, and for putting up with us.
Yeah, and use promo code NDYT to sign up for a 30-day free trial at InsideNDSports.com, and make sure you're subscribed to us here, like the video, leave some comments, and share our feed with some friends as well. We like to get in front of as many people as we can, and like we always do, we'll be here on a weekly basis.
Right.
Even through speak for yourself, Eric. I'm nervous. I take a shot before every show. No, I'm kidding. I do not do that. But we appreciate you guys tuning in and making jokes, even if it's while I'm trying to explain something which is very, very serious. But no, I'm kidding. I appreciate you guys having a good time, and we'll catch you next week.